My life was pretty straightforward until that evening. I'm Lucy, a 29-year-old web designer, living in a cozy house, the one I grew up in. My husband, Mark, is an engineer at a local factory. He's a big guy, always buried in his gadgets, coming home to either play on the computer or scroll endlessly on his phone. That evening, I was tapping away on my laptop, trying to wrap up a project, when Mark walked in, looking more serious than usual. He slumped down next to me, causing the couch to creak under his weight. "Lucy, we need to talk," he said, running his hands through his hair. I paused, sensing the weight of his words. "It's about my grandma, Eleanor. She's not doing well, and I want to bring her here to live with us." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Here? In our house?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, here. She's got senile dementia, Lucy. She needs family around her," he insisted, his brow furrowed. I remembered Eleanor from our wedding, a lively woman, her laughter filling the room. The image didn't fit the frail, ailing grandmother Mark was describing. "Mark, you know our house isn't big. And we both work full-time. How are we supposed to care for her?" I questioned, my tone rising. "We'll figure it out, Lucy. She's my grandma. We can't just leave her," he shot back, his voice firm. The room filled with a tense silence. I looked at him, his eyes pleading. I sighed, feeling the weight of the situation descend upon me. "And what about her house, her stuff?" I probed, trying to understand the full picture. "She can't live alone anymore, Lucy. And about her stuff, well, that's the thing. She's got a will. If we put her in a nursing home, we lose everything. She's wealthy, you know that. It's all because of her late husband," he explained, his voice softening. I shook my head, feeling trapped. "So, it's about the money too?" I accused, the words bitter in my mouth. "It's not like that. It's just, we have to think about everything, Lucy. It's complicated," he defended, his face flushed. I stood up, pacing the room. "We should discuss this together, Mark. It's not just your decision. This is my house too, remember?" He nodded, looking up at me with those big, tired eyes. I know. Let's sit down and figure this out, okay? But just know, she's family, Lucy. We can't turn our backs on her." As I sat back down, the weight of the decision pressed down on me. The idea of caring for an elderly relative was daunting, and the thought of our lives turning upside down was overwhelming. The night stretched on as we discussed, argued, and planned. But one thing was clear, like it or not, Eleanor's arrival was going to change everything. And this was just the beginning. The next morning, after a restless night, I was sipping my coffee when Mark brought in a stack of papers. The top sheet was a legal document, Eleanor's will. He sat down across from me, the morning light casting shadows on his worried face. "Lucy, look at this," he said, tapping the paper. "This is the will. Everything's there, the house, the money, all of it." She was clear. "No nursing homes, or it all goes to charity." I took the document, my eyes scanning the formal language. It was all there in black and white. Eleanor had been explicit. I felt a twinge of respect for her determination, even as it complicated our lives. "And what about her care?" I asked, setting the paper down. "How do we manage that and work at the same time?" Mark ran his fingers through his hair, a sign of his frustration. "We can hire someone, maybe a nurse or a caretaker." "And who's going to pay for that, huh?" I snapped, the reality of the situation sinking in. "We aren't exactly rolling in dough, Mark." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We'll use some of the inheritance money. It's what she would have wanted, right? To make sure she's taken care of?" I folded my arms, skeptical. "Seems convenient. Use her own money to make sure we get the rest of it." "It's not like that, Lucy," he retorted, his voice rising. "This is about family, about doing the right thing." I looked away, the bitterness swelling in my throat. Right, the right thing. And when did we decide that her living with us was the right thing? He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. When I realized she had no one else, Lucy. My sister's got her hands full, and my parents are too old to deal with this. I stood too, my own anger flaring. And what about me, Mark? What about my work, my life? Do I just put everything on hold for this? He paused. I know it's a lot to ask, Lucy. But we're in this together, aren't we? I let out a long sigh, the fight draining out of me. Together, I echoed, though the word felt heavy on my tongue. We spent the rest of the day making calls, arranging for assessments and care consultations. The reality of our decision was setting in, each phone call a reminder of the commitment we were about to undertake. By evening, we had a plan, albeit a shaky one. A nurse would come in during the day, and we'd take turns caring for Eleanor at night. The costs would be covered by the inheritance, at least for now. The day Mrs. Eleanor arrived is etched into my memory with stark clarity. The van rolled up, and there she was, frail and disoriented in her wheelchair. Mark's sister and parents were there too, all hands to help with the move. But as soon as Eleanor was settled in, they vanished, leaving me staring at the back of their departing car, the weight of responsibility heavy in my chest. Mark seemed oblivious to my growing panic, casually handing me a list of Eleanor's needs and schedules as if I were a hired nurse. You work from home, Lucy, you can manage this better, he said, not meeting my eyes. I was flabbergasted. Manage this? Mark, I'm a web designer, not a caretaker. And what about you? She's your grandmother. He shrugged, the conversation clearly over for him. I've got to keep working, we need the money, especially now. You know how important this inheritance is. That was it for him, the inheritance. It felt like a slap in the face, his priorities laid bare. The first few days were a whirlwind of medication schedules, doctor's visits, and constant vigilance. Mrs. Eleanor, lost in the throes of her dementia, was a handful. She'd refuse to eat, try to wander off, or become suddenly aggressive. I was out of my depth, and the hired nurses weren't faring much better. Each nurse we hired left within days, citing the demanding nature of the job. She needs professional care, not just a babysitter, one commented on her way out. Their words echoed in my mind, but Mark dismissed them. They're just not trying hard enough. You can handle it, Lucy. As the burden grew, so did the tension between Mark and me. One particularly rough day, after Eleanor had a terrible episode, I confronted him. I can't do this alone, Mark. It's your grandmother. You need to help. He was unyielding, his eyes cold. I'm working, Lucy. And if you can't handle it, maybe you shouldn't work. Look, it's either you take care of her, or we consider other options. I was stunned. Other options? Like what, Mark? A divorce? The word hung between us, heavy and foreboding. He didn't back down. If that's what it takes. We need this money, Lucy. You know that. I was trapped, caught between my crumbling marriage and the demanding, unending care of a woman who no longer seemed to recognize anyone around her. My home, once a place of comfort and love, had turned into a prison, a constant reminder of the sacrifice I was being forced to make. Mark's detachment from the whole situation was clear. He'd pop in to see his grandmother, offer some words, then retreat to his work or his phone, leaving the chaos for me to handle. The resentment built, a silent storm brewing in the heart of our home. I was alone in this, utterly alone. This was not the life I had signed up for, nor the man I thought I had married. But there I was, stuck in a home-turned-hospital, nursing a woman who didn't even know my name. The strain of caring for Mrs. Eleanor started to seep into every corner of our lives. The house was always in disarray, medical supplies littered every surface, and the constant need for vigilance left me running on fumes. Mark was hardly ever present, and when he was, it was like living with a ghost of the man I married. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I slumped at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee my only companion. Mark walked in, his face buried in his phone. Another nurse quit today, I said, the words heavy with defeat. He barely glanced up. Find another one then, he replied, his voice flat. I slammed my hand down, the cup rattling. It's not that easy, Mark. They can't handle her, and frankly, neither can I. This is crazy. He finally looked at me, annoyance flickering in his eyes. What do you want me to do, Lucy? Quit my job? We can't afford that, and you know it. I stood up, the frustration boiling over. I want you to care. To help. This is your grandmother, not some stranger off the street. Mark let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. I'm doing what I can, Lucy. I'm working to pay for all this. By leaving it all on me? I shot back. I'm working too, Mark, or at least I was. Now I'm just a full-time nurse to a woman who thinks I'm her enemy. The silence that followed was tense, each of us stewing in our own resentment. I need a break, Mark. Even a day. Something to feel like myself again, I pleaded, my voice cracking with exhaustion. He shrugged, a gesture that stung more than any words. Take a day then. I'll stay with her this weekend. But when the weekend came, his promise fell flat. Something came up at work. I can't, he said, avoiding my gaze. I felt a surge of anger, hot and bitter. Something always comes up. When will it be our turn, Mark? When do we matter? He didn't answer, just grabbed his keys and left, the door slamming shut behind him. I was left alone, again, with the daunting task of caring for Eleanor. That night, as I tried to coax Eleanor to sleep, her words were like daggers. You don't care about me. No one does, she mumbled, lost in her own world. The words echoed in my head, a cruel reflection of my own thoughts. I cared, too much, and it was breaking me. Days turned into weeks, and the situation didn't improve. I was a shell of my former self, running on autopilot. My work suffered, my friendships faded, and my relationship with Mark was hanging by a thread. One evening, I broke down, tears streaming down my face as I sat on the bathroom floor. I can't do this anymore, I whispered to no one in particular. The reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a woman consumed by her sacrifice. I missed laughter, I missed freedom, I missed me. But most of all, I missed the man I thought I had married, the partner I thought I'd face life's challenges with. Instead, I was facing them alone, a solitary figure in a home that felt more like a hospital each day. One night, the house was unusually quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and my own shallow breathing. I had been dozing off in the living room, too tired to move to the bed, when a faint sound startled me awake. It was singing, a soft, melodic tune that seemed out of place in the still night. Rubbing my eyes, I stood up, following the sound to the kitchen. There, under the dim light, was Mrs. Eleanor, fully awake, sipping tea, and flipping through a magazine, humming to herself. My mouth fell open in shock. Mrs. Eleanor? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her eyes sharp and clear, not a hint of confusion. Oh, Lucy, dear, did I wake you? I fancied a bit of tea. I was dumbfounded. But how are you? She set the magazine down, a sly smile playing on her lips. Oh, I suppose the cat's out of the bag now. Sit down, dear, let's chat. As I sat across from her, she began to explain. I'm not as far gone as everyone thinks. A bit forgetful, yes, but not lost. I've been pretending, you see, to test the waters, to see who truly cares. I was astounded, my mind racing with questions. But why? Why put us through all this? She sighed, her smile fading. When you're old and wealthy, dear, you become a target. Relatives come out of the woodwork, all sweet smiles and helping hands, but all they really want is a piece of the pie. I had to know who I could trust. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time, the chaos, the stress, it was all a test? But what about us? What about me? I asked, a mix of anger and relief flooding through me. Mrs. Eleanor reached out, her hand gently covering mine. You, my dear, have been nothing but kind and patient. A saint, truly. I'm sorry for the ruse, but it was necessary. I pulled my hand away, my emotions a whirlwind. So, what now? Does Mark know about this? She shook her head. No, not yet. And I'd prefer it stays that way for a little while longer. I'm not quite done observing. I stood up, my mind made up. This ends now, Mrs. Eleanor. The pretending, the games, all of it. It's not fair to anyone. She looked up at me, a twinkle in her eye. Fair enough, dear. But let's keep it between us for now, shall we? I promise, no more games. As I went back to bed, her words echoed in my mind. The revelation was both a relief and a new burden. I was free from the constant care, but now I was a keeper of a significant secret, one that could change everything. Life had settled into an uneasy routine. I was back to working full-time, while Mrs. Eleanor, very much aware and capable, whipped up the most amazing dishes for us. We'd laugh and chat, our relationship blossoming into something genuine and warm amidst the chaos. But that warmth was about to be tested. The doorbell rang one afternoon, shattering our peaceful bubble. Mark's sister Linda barged in with her parents in tow, their eyes roaming the house like vultures. Mrs. Eleanor sat quietly, a frail figure in her chair, a master at playing her part. "All right, let's get down to brass tacks," Linda announced, her voice slicing through the niceties. "We're here to discuss the assets. It's time to split things up properly." I frowned, watching them circle like sharks. "Split what up?" "Eleanor's right here, and she's not going anywhere." Mark, who had been silent, chimed in. "Lucy, stay out of this. This is family stuff." "Family? And what am I then?" I snapped, my patience thinning. His mother scoffed. "You're just the wife, dear. Here by convenience." I stood up, my anger flaring. "I've cared for Eleanor more than any of you ever did. And you dare talk about splitting her assets right in front of her?" Linda leaned in, her words venomous. "Listen here, honey, you're way out of your league. This is about the inheritance, big money, something you couldn't possibly understand." Mrs. Eleanor sat silently, her eyes flicking between us, a slight nod to me the only sign of our shared secret. Mark's father spoke up. "We're just taking what's rightfully ours. Eleanor would have wanted her family to be well off." "That's bull, and you know it," I retorted. "All you care about is the money. Not once did you ask if she's happy or healthy." The room erupted into shouting, each trying to shout over the other. It was then Mark turned to me, his face hard and cold. "Lucy, you're nothing but an outsider in this. And you know what? I'm done. Done with you, done with all of this. I've got someone else now, someone who understands me." The words hit like a truck. I stared at him, the man I thought I knew, now a stranger. "So, that's it, huh? After all this, you're just walking away?" He didn't even flinch. "Yeah, that's right. I'm out. And once this is all settled, I'll be sitting pretty with my share." The greed was palpable, the air thick with it. Mrs. Eleanor finally stood up, her voice strong and clear, cutting through the noise. "Enough," she thundered. "I've sat here, listening to you all squabble over me like I'm a prize pig at the fair. But I'm not. I'm a person, and I'm disgusted by what I've heard." The room went silent, everyone went into a state of shock. And Linda almost fainted. Mrs. Eleanor's gaze was steely. "I pretended to be moral than I am, to see how you'd all react. And oh, what a revelation it's been." The room erupted into chaos, everyone speaking at once. "Pretended? What the hell does that mean?" Linda's voice was sharp, accusatory. "You're all so eager for your share, so blinded by greed that you can't see what's right in front of you," Grandma said. She turned to me, her gaze softening. "Lucy, you've been a light in this dark time. And for that, I'm grateful." As the family left, their tails between their legs, Mark shot me a look of pure venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. But it was over, at least for me. Mrs. Eleanor had orchestrated the family dinner with precision, inviting every relative. The house buzzed with a tense energy as they gathered, whispers and sideways glances filling the room. I stood beside Mrs. Eleanor, feeling more like an ally than ever. As we all sat down to dinner, the clinking of cutlery and forced pleasantries couldn't mask the undercurrent of greed that had brought them all here. Mrs. Eleanor let them chatter for a while, biding her time. Then, as the main course was served, she cleared her throat, commanding the room's attention. "I've invited you all here, for a reason," she began, her voice strong and unyielding. "I've seen it all. The way you've circled like vultures, waiting for your piece. Well, I'm not dead yet, and I won't be your meal ticket." Mark's sister, Linda, tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on, grandmother. What are you saying?" Mrs. Eleanor's gaze was like steel. "I'm saying I know about the greed, the plotting. And I'm disgusted." Mark's face turned a deep shade of red, his eyes darting between me and his grandmother. "This is your doing, isn't it, Lucy? You've been filling her head with nonsense." I stood my ground, my voice calm but firm. "No, Mark. I've been caring for your grandmother while you and your family counted the dollars in her bank account." The accusations flew, tempers flaring. Mark's father banged his fist on the table. "You can't just change everything. We're your family." Mrs. Eleanor didn't flinch. "A family that sees me as a paycheck? No, I don't think so. I'm changing my will, and none of you are included. Not after what I've witnessed." Mark stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're going to regret this, both of you. You'll see." But Mrs. Eleanor was resolute. "No, Mark. I think it's you who will regret. Regret how you treated me, how you let your greed blind you." As the relatives stormed out, muttering curses and threats, I felt a mix of fear and triumph. The truth was out, the masks had fallen off. Mrs. Eleanor and I were in this together, come what may. The door slammed shut on the last of them, and the house fell into a heavy silence. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the recent upheaval. Mrs. Eleanor and I sat in the living room, a pot of tea between us, discussing the future. The chaos of the past week seemed like a distant memory, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of calm. "So, what now?" I asked, breaking the silence. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Now, my dear, we start fresh. A new will, a new way of living. And for you, a new life without the dead weight of greed." I chuckled, the sound light and free. "I can't believe it's over. That you're really going to rewrite your will." She nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, and this time it'll be on my terms. No more manipulation, no more greed." The doorbell rang, shattering the moment. I stood to answer it, my heart in my throat. It was a delivery man, a large envelope in his hands. "Lucy Collins?" he asked, and I nodded, taking the envelope. It was the divorce papers, Mark's final act of cowardice. I signed them, a feeling of liberation washing over me as I handed them back to the man. When I returned, Mrs. Eleanor was watching me, a knowing look on her face. "All done?" she asked. "All done," I confirmed, a smile spreading across my face. "It's official. I'm free." We spent the day planning, talking about renovations to the house, trips we could take, and the joy of living without fear or obligation. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the room, Mrs. Eleanor turned to me. "Lucy, I want you to know, I'm leaving the house to you. And a good portion of my assets. You've earned it, more than anyone." I was speechless, tears pricking at my eyes. "Mrs. Eleanor, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll live your life to the fullest," she replied, her voice firm. "No looking back, no regrets." I nodded, a sense of determination filling me. "I promise. And I'll take care of you, too. We'll take care of each other." The next few days were a blur of activity. Lawyers, financial advisors, and contractors came and went, each playing a part in our new beginning. And through it all, Mrs. Eleanor and I stood firm, a team against the world. "Here's to new beginnings," I said, raising my cup of tea. "To new beginnings," Mrs. Eleanor echoed, her eyes bright with hope. The future was unknown, but it was mine to shape, and I was ready for whatever came next. With a sense of purpose and a heart full of gratitude, I stepped into the new day, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.